Thank you, Ona. It has been such an exciting summit so far, and I know that we are so thrilled with all the information. The ACT report has finally come and been released to the public. So without further ado, let me introduce two amazing people. Hopefully, Bo will be able to join us when we work through our technical issues. So first, let me introduce John A. Powell. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute and the holder of the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He is a professor of law, African American, and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And he was previously the executive director at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. And prior to that, the founder and director of the Institute for Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. Bo, welcome. She is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Uber. She partners with senior leadership to build a work culture where radically diverse and inclusive teams drive innovation, accelerate growth, and build a work culture that where systems and all employees have the opportunity to excel and grow to their highest potential. Prior to joining Uber, Bo was the first Global Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the risk and insurance services businesses of Marsh and McLennan companies. So I am very excited to have a conversation with these two amazing and dynamic leaders. Please read more about their bios that are attached. But first, let me ground us before we start the conversation on inclusive leadership. So to foster inclusive culture, we know that CEOs first need to understand how they can be inclusive leaders. In the report, we talk a lot about inclusive leadership. And from that report, we also say that inclusive leadership is a skill and it must be developed and rewarded. So when we think about rewards, that could include things like part of a company's performance review process. We know that it's a practice, something that we should be cultivating and building every day rather than just a fixed set of traits. So I'm going to start with Bo. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think inclusive leadership is and how you go about defining it?
Sure, of course, and thank you, Dwana. I think inclusive leadership has actually evolved over time. So at its core, I always think of inclusive leadership fundamentally being one of what I call radical empathy and radical curiosity. It is about wanting to understand who's on my team, who's around me, what is their background, what motivates them, and then based on that information, trying to create an environment where that person can thrive, right? So fundamentally, I think inclusive leadership is about like radical curiosity. And it also is about radical curiosity about yourself, because each of us thinks that we're just kind of the norm and everyone is kind of a deviation from our norm. But part of the things that an inclusive leader does every single day is say, why do I do the things I do? I know, for example, that I'm a New Yorker. I'm very direct. I'm very, I cut right to the chase of things. And I work for a company that's headquartered in California. A lot of my team members are in California and they have a very different communication norm. If I just assumed that my directness was just a norm rather than something that was influenced by the environment around me, I would have this expectation that everyone should communicate like me. And if they don't, there's something fundamentally wrong about them. I do think one thing that we're seeing that's very different and that's changing around inclusive leadership is the conversation around diversity and inclusion is at this accelerated pace of transformation. And so, we're starting to see people coming out as gender non-binary, for example, at a rate that we've never seen before. That requires education as well. So the inclusive leader is not only just fundamentally curious, but they're also engaging in development of themselves, their language. They are going out there, they're reading, they're following people on Twitter that they've never thought that they should follow before, because they know how quickly the conversation is changing.
Yes, exactly that. John, what's your definition or take on inclusive leadership?
Dwana, thank you. And first of all, I want to congratulate you, Snapchat, and others for producing this amazing report. So leadership, as both suggested, the way we think about it has changed. It used to be the sole person, usually a man who was in control and dictating to everyone else. We now think of leadership as distributive and inclusive, And I want to even go beyond the word inclusive and talk about belonging.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, a leader brings together a team and makes them feel like they belong. And in belonging, the heart of belonging, which is a little different than inclusion, is co-creation. You're asking people to participate in co-creating. And so in a sense, the most important thing that a leader does in many regards is to create a space and container where everyone feels like they can belong. And as Bo says, everyone means you have people with different abilities, different life experiences. How do you hold that? Because people will be challenging. Sometimes I think of an inclusive leader as an orchestra conductor. He or she may not play the trumpet or the violin, but they actually help people come together and play together. So that's the container that they create. And they do that. There are things that you can do in terms of skills, but you have to be deliberate about it. And the last thing I'll say again, echoing Bo, is that this sort of curiosity, willingness to listen, willing to invite, I think something, but I might be wrong. Let me hear from you. Let me challenge me, push me. Sometimes people are afraid of the leader. And so even if they think the leader's doing something wrong, they won't say anything. And then the final thing I'll say is commitment. We have to know that the leader is really committed to these values. But they're not just giving something to their, mid-level managers, but this is a personal commitment and a personal journey that they, as the leader, is on and that the company is on as well.
Awesome. John, I love that you jumped right into belonging. How do you define, or what's the difference between belonging and DEI, or is there a difference?
There's a difference, and it's words have meaning and they have histories. Lots of time we don't know them, but it's important. So let me just say two examples. If you go back, and you have the capacity to do that being tech companies, if you go back before 1978, you will almost not find the word diversity in the common language. Where did that word come from? How did it become so important? Well, there was a case of students, affirmative action case in Davis Medical School based on race, based on racial discrimination, based on the exclusion of blacks, the history of blacks being kept out, not because of personal animus, but because of the system and structure. Justice Powell wrote the opinion, and he basically said, we're not looking at systemic racism. I don't know what societal discrimination is. That's too amorphous. So he dismissed that. But he said, what universities can do, they can actually make race a plus factor if they want to have diversity. There's a lot of importance in that. I won't spend too much time on it. But the original meaning of diversity, in some ways, was opposite of a systems approach, was denying societal discrimination. So it's a very narrow representative focus. And I'm glad your report is really focused on systems, which takes us, in a sense, certainly beyond the way Justice Powell thought about diversity. And so diversity doesn't mean inclusion. Diversity doesn't mean belonging. You can have a lot of people there, and that's diversity. It doesn't tell you what the power relationship is. It doesn't tell you how people are treated. It doesn't tell you retention rates. Now, obviously, we mean more than that. And I think what people are leaning into belonging. And then just one other suggestion. Inclusion, the way it's practiced in most companies, in most places, is the person or group being invited in come in as members, come in as guests. Like we have this company, oftentimes in tech companies, it's a male-generated company. The culture is never the male. They bring in women, they bring in people of color, and it's like, you have to adapt. This is a bro culture, but you who are not bros, you can adapt. So they become guests. They're invited into your home, but they can't change the furniture. They can't change the music. They can't change the color. It's like, you have to adapt. Belonging says, no, you're coming in with your full voice. We're not asking you to be a guest. We're asking you to be a full member and participate in co-creation. So belonging is, in a sense, inclusion 2.0. We want your full self. So I think the spirit of that report is actually about belonging. And you mentioned the word a few times. And I'm hoping in the future you'll grab onto the word more robustly.
We've heard a lot of organizations, DEI organizations, adding the B to it. Bo, can you reflect a little bit about what belonging means in your career and as well as your workspaces?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of just my own career, I love John's definition and this idea that not that long ago, the expectation was that women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ were invited in, but they were expected to adapt. And I recalling my own experience, my first job out of university was at a management consulting firm. The first thing I did with my signing bonus that I got was actually I went out to Brooks Brothers and bought myself 5 business suits, gray, navy blue, black, one for every single day of the week. And if anyone knows me, they know me that like I am not a Brooks Brother 3-piece suit kind of gal. Like I love my colors, I love my prints. But in my mind, like at that time when I was like fresh out of university, 21 years old, I really thought I'm going to be successful in this corporate world. I had to look like the white 40-something-year-old guys that were there. And it really wasn't until I went to business school and I was getting my MBA when I had the sudden realization that everything that was being taught to me in my MBA program was being taught to me with the assumption that I was a 40-something, or I was going to become a 40-something cis hetero white male leader. And I was sitting there, 26 years old, first generation immigrant, funny name, didn't lead, didn't talk like any of the professors that were teaching me. And I kept on asking this question. Okay, that works in this case study where all the protagonists are white men in their, cis hetero middle age, but there's nobody in a case study that looks like me. So I have no fundamental idea of what I needed to do to be successful. And so I think I would say the first generation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we look back 20, 30 years, they were just kind of looking at like, how do we enable these one-offs, this African American, this woman, this person of color, this LGBTQ, how can we strengthen them up so that they can survive in this quite rather at times hostile work environment that doesn't reflect anything that is core to their fundamental values. I think one of the things that we've really seen change as this concept of both belonging, but now even equity started working in is how do we fundamentally change the nature of business so that when we look at competencies, when we look at what good leadership looks like, it actually looks like somebody like me, someone who is, loquacious, not a circular thinker, not always linear, not always terse, doesn't want to wear that suit, doesn't want to necessarily come in and just flatten myself and dull myself to something that is familiar to everyone else. So part of belonging isn't just making the individual feel like they can survive, but it's actually transforming the base nature of the culture of the company that we're working in so that when I look in, I naturally see some place where I can thrive, where I can be successful, where I can find, my people. And, when I say my people, I mean like broadly. So, and that's what really truly what belonging looks like. And that's the evolution. It's gone from helping the individual to actually transforming the organization.
I love that, Bo. So I'm sticking with you, Bo. How do you give personal signals that you're an inclusive leader? And then also, how do you tie that into corporate governance?
Yeah, of course. Well, first, personally for me, I go back to that first principle of don't assume that you're the norm, or don't assume that I am the norm and that everyone's a deviation from that norm. So when I first joined Uber, I've been at Uber now for about 4 years. The first thing I did is I said, hey, when I'm meeting with every single member of my team, I start asking them, I'm like, tell me about yourself. Tell me how you like to communicate. How do you like to receive feedback? What are important things in your work-life integration that I should know about, so that I'm taking that into consideration as we are working together? And then constantly checking in and saying, hey, does this way I'm providing feedback for you, does it work for you? Because I know it works for me, right? But is it working for you? Do you understand? So it's management is not, sometimes we have the sense that like leadership and management is just like a one-way street. I, as the leader, as the senior person, talk to you as my subordinate, and you receive wisdom from me. But I think one of the really big changes is that it's actually like a two-way, multi-way street where, yes, you are learning from me, but I am learning from you. And we're constantly we're constantly checking in with each other. I think that's another aspect of leadership. And one of the ways you signal is checking in, just saying, are you thriving? And when somebody on your team says, you know what, I'm not thriving in this moment, not being very, very humble about that and not taking that as a personal attack that you've done something wrong. Because we don't know what's going on, especially in this last year and a half. We've seen that there has been so much that COVID has triggered within our workforce. And we don't know what's going on in other people's worlds. We don't know what losses they've suffered. We don't know who they're caring for. We don't know what the complexity. We don't know, how COVID has impacted their mental health. Someone might be thriving, not thriving. It may be about you, but it may not. but you won't know that unless you're actually asking that question. So the best signal is simply keeping that feedback loop. Now, in terms of what that means from a corporate governance, like one of the things that we have tried to do at Uber in this last year and a half is trying to make this cadence of managers being responsible for checking in with their workforce part of the role of the manager. So one of the things we did very early on and during COVID was we said, hey, manager, for every single one of your team members, sit down with them and say, how are you doing? First and foremost, right? And just ask that simple question. How are you doing? What's going on in your personal life right now in the middle of this pandemic? Do you have caregiver responsibilities? Do you have complexity? Are you struggling with mental health right now, even if you don't have any caregiver responsibilities? And then we created what we call enhanced flexibility. We said, really, like, you manager, you, rather than putting the onus on the individual, the IC, the individual contributor, and saying, you have a responsibility to tell me if you need flexibility. We said, managers, why don't you go ahead and ask, do you need any flexibility? Can I make adjustments? Do you need to alter around your work hours so that we can accommodate for whatever is going on in your life? And so that's something we've taken this like individual skill that a manager can do, just checking in, the routine, getting to know their teams. And we've made it something where we said, this is actually part of your responsibility, managers. Please do it. And of course, the expectation is like other people are checking in with those managers as well, so that it becomes a feedback loop.
Awesome. John, I'm going to grab a question from the audience. It's similar, but a different spin, which I think you can lend your expertise to. How do leaders create a space for their team to truly feel comfortable showing up as their authentic self?
That's a great question. So there have been a number of studies now over the last 5 years in terms of why people, especially middle-level managers, why they stay at a company, what makes them comfortable. Well, Coquell did a study in ServiceNow, and I'll acknowledge that I participated in both of those studies. So if you see my name, it's not just self-advertising. But people after a point, it's like, okay, I'm making enough money. The company is comfortable enough, but do I belong? Do I have a sense of this is my place? And I think companies have now taken on belong audits to ask people the questions that Bo suggested. So companies could do that. And there's work out there, there's to help companies do it. I want to just mention two other things though. So Bo mentioned talking to the individual. We're all individuals, so none of us are just individuals. And so part of it is also thinking about the groups. So we know, for example, if you're the only Black woman out of 1,000 workers, your work clause still talks about suffering from likely to be suffering from stereotype threat. If you don't have a critical mass. There's a conference now going on in terms of climate change. One of the ministers shows up at the conference in a wheelchair and he can't get in the building. So the structure is actually othering him. The structure is saying, you don't belong. Like, come have this meeting, fly halfway across the world, and then you can't get in the door. And so it's really looking at the structures, it's looking at groups, it's looking at systems, it's looking at data. All those things are important. And they make us not only better managers and better leaders, but the McKinsey study shows over and over again, when you do this right and you have people feel like they belong, it also helps the bottom line.
Can I just add something? Because what John is mentioning is so important, I think, from the othering and talking about groups. So one thing that we became, as we started as a company really investigating what it means to be an anti-racist organization, we started talking to our groups. And one thing we really realized is in the pre-COVID world, our Black employees were more likely than our non-Black employees to be questioned by security as to what they're doing in our buildings. So for example, they would more routinely be stopped by security if they didn't have like their visible badge on them, going, and very politely, hey, can I see your badge? Or what are you doing here? And the consequences of that happening, though, is especially if, like, let's say one of our colleagues, an engineer, was going in to make a huge presentation to our chief technology officer. Imagine that you were getting ready to do that, and like right when you enter one of our buildings, a security guard stops you, but lets everybody else in, but stops you and says, "Where's your badge? Do you belong here?" That simple act could just mess up their mind, and then imagine what would happen when they go into that presentation. They are not going to be at the top of their game. And so one of the things that we as an organization, we've been asking ourselves is where, sometimes people call these microaggressions, but I would actually just call them aggressions. like, where does these things happen in our organization on a daily basis that, like, I'm certainly not guilty of, like, questioning someone's security. Dara, our CEO, isn't. But if we built, like, a security system that queries the darker skinned of us more and questions their literal existence in our building, how is that going to impact the performance? And so belonging really goes to your point, John, of structure. And when other professionals, DEI professionals, it's not simply looking at your hiring process. It's not looking at your promotion process. It's about looking at these really almost unconscious systemic things that we've built.
I think that's exactly right. I know we're maybe running out of time. I just want to push one other idea. I mean, I read the report, beautiful report. Again, congratulations. I like 2 suggestions. One, tech companies, it's not just building DEI internally. As Sin Marshall, who's the CEO of the Dallas Mavericks and the first Black woman to be head of a professional basketball team, she talks about, someone asked her, when will we achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion? And she said, we won't achieve it before society. We're part of society. We have to sort of think of our relationship with society. And so as the tech companies, and they know, I mean, the tech companies is changing the world. It's not an internally focused system. When we talk about system, and it's not a closed system. So I want to really push the leaders and think about your place in the world. Think about how you can influence the world. Think about it beyond, if you have 4 walls, your walls. And similarly, one of the things in your report is really saying, let's educate young people to be better in terms of computers and tech. Completely agree, but too limited. To be a good citizen, to be a good manager, to be a good member of society, you have to have more than tech. We used to call them the humanities. So don't just think if people are engineers, you've done your job. Jefferson, one of the founders of education in the American system, believed the primary purpose of education was to make people good citizens. And to be a good citizen, you have to be able to take the perspective of the other. Jefferson got a lot of stuff wrong, but he got that right.
Yes. Bo, one final call to action for the audience with regards to inclusive leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say lean into the hard conversations. If you're not having difficult conversations, if you're not uncomfortable as you're talking about what it means to be inclusive, what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to be gender inclusive, then you're not having the right conversation.
Yes. Yes, done. Bo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mommy.